Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us on our weekly AJA Zoom event, and welcome to any new people this week. I would also like to welcome any people from our communal organisations who may be watching, and I hope you enjoy the session. We also have people watching on Facebook, and there are some who listen to the audio replay, which is broadcast every Thursday at midday and Sundays at 4 p.m. on J-Air Community Radio. That's at FM 88 in Melbourne or j-air.com.au everywhere else. So welcome to you all. My name is Alan Freedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association. Also visible on your screen, you can see David Adler, President of the AJA, and our guest for tonight, Yona Schiffmiller from NGO Monitor. And of course, the topic is World Vision in Gaza and the conviction of Mohammed El-Halabi. The format tonight will be a presentation from Yona, and then we'll open it up for questions. If you do want to ask a question and you're not familiar with our system, what we ask you to do is raise your hand electronically. That sends us a signal, and then we can see that you want to ask a question and unmute you when the time comes. If you like, you can write written questions on the chat function. Robert Gregory, our Director of Public Affairs, will read some of those out during question time. And of course, if you don't like the chat function, you can always disable it by clicking on the little menu. Now, World Vision is a Christian charity with a branch in Australia, previously led for 12 years by Tim Costello, a self-described humanitarian and the brother of our former treasurer, Peter Costello. Whilst Peter was Israel-friendly, Tim takes a very different view. People may remember that a few years ago, a controversy erupted over Mohammed El-Halabi, an employee of World Vision who was charged with funneling World Vision money off to Hamas for terror purposes. This case reached its conclusion a couple of weeks ago, and to tell us all about it, we have Yona Schiffmiller, NGO Monitor's Director of Research, with us tonight. Yona holds an MA in International Security and Diplomacy Studies from Hebrew University, where he also received his BA in Political Science and International Relations. His articles and op-eds have appeared in The Hill, The Forward, Yisrael Hayom, and other outlets. Yona, good evening, or for us, and good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us in Australia, and thanks for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Alan, for the invitation, and Dr. Adler, and thank you all for taking the time this evening. So I will very, very briefly introduce NGO Monitor, and then we can dive right into it. So NGO Monitor, for those of you who may not be familiar, is a Jerusalem-based research organization. We've been around for about 20 years or so. And our specific area of expertise is looking at NGOs, non-governmental organizations that are involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so this can be organizations that promote BDS, that lobby international fora or governments related to issues on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it can also be, in this case, organizations that claim to advance humanitarian efforts in the region. And so I want to start by looking at how we got to this point. Mohammed El-Halabi was arrested in 2016, but NGO Monitor's research into World Vision and its potential for aid diversion begins a little bit earlier. So I'm sure you all saw the news from Israel over the last few days. Again, you know, a military confrontation and rocket fire from the Gaza Strip. In 2014, as we all remember, Operation Protective Edge, 2 months of intense fighting between Israel and Palestinian terrorist organizations based in Gaza. And following the end of that operation, at NGO Monitor, we began research into the role of humanitarian actors in Gaza, because at the time, there was a lot of effort being put into putting together international plans for rebuilding Gaza. How do we bring cement into Gaza? How do we bring steel into Gaza to rebuild all of the infrastructure that was damaged during fighting without using or without allowing Hamas and other organizations to take advantage of those materials. And so we wanted to understand better the ways in which humanitarian actors are involved on the ground in Gaza. And one of the things we did was we looked at the international standards that are utilized by humanitarian actors. When humanitarian organizations go into conflict zones, what are their own standards for ensuring that aid isn't diverted, that it's not commandeered by terrorists, militias, armed groups, call them what you like. And so we found two things in this regard that were relevant to World Vision and sort of very much educated us on the way in which World Vision approaches these issues. The first is we found a standard that World Vision itself was promoting. It had written it alongside a number of other international aid providers. And this was sort of their way of talking about what to do when armed groups are trying to commandeer your aid. What are the ways that you should engage with those organizations? And so one of the things that we found very, very worrying was that in this standard, it said, if armed groups are demanding aid, are demanding payment for allowing aid into conflict zones, one of the things that organizations should do is, quote, find local anti-corruption champions and try to explain that corruption hurts everyone. And so this already made us think that these people think that they're providing aid in Sydney and not in Gaza. I'm not quite sure what local anti-corruption champions you're supposed to work with when you're in a conflict zone. But the second thing that we found about World Vision that really colored our perception of the organization and the sense to which it is committed to ensuring that its aid isn't diverted came from World Vision's own publications. And in one of World Vision's publications, this is going back a few years, they surveyed employees and they asked them about World Vision's policies related to the way that World Vision interacts with armed groups. And do people at World Vision employees find that these policies are properly calibrated and that they are effective at both allowing the organization to deliver aid, but also at maintaining the healthy distance that it needs to hold from terrorist organizations. And I just want to read you a quote from this World Vision report titled Principled Pragmatism. The question that was posed was, from your experience, do you feel that the ethical foundations of World Vision have ever been jeopardized or threatened by engaging with armed groups? Response, yes. We are not certain where the line is between being practical and therefore liaising with the local power base and taking a principled stand. Having armed actors to enable us to do our job has always had me debating the pros and cons of where World Vision should position itself with respect to this important matter. So already in 2015, when we published this book, we were already concerned about World Vision. And we even concluded that section by saying that we were very, very concerned. And we wrote that this raises questions as to whether the group would prevent components of its aid from being misappropriated by terrorist organizations. So that's where we were in August of 2016, when the Israeli security agency, the Shabak, announced that it had arrested Mohammed al-Halabi and that it was charging him with a number of offenses related to diversion of aid to terrorist organizations, exclusively to Hamas, of diverting around $50 million in aid materials to Hamas. Now, as you know, the trial took place in the district court in Beersheba. It was a closed-door trial. And so for several years, we really didn't know what was going on behind closed doors until June of this year, when the district court found Mr. al-Halabi guilty of the charges leveled against him. And so what I want to do is I want to explain a little bit about what he was charged with, going through, the rap sheet, as it were, and sort of focusing on specific actions that he was found guilty of. And the second part of what I want to speak about is, or I guess three parts, if you will. That's the first part. The second part is to analyze it a little bit and explain what ramifications and what the implications are of these charges on humanitarian aid and the ways in which it can be manipulated. And lastly, I want to talk about World Vision's own audit process. What is it that we found out about the way that World Vision audits itself? What is it that we found out during this process about the way that World Vision is able to or unable to keep its own house in order? And again, the implications for that moving forward. So moving quickly to the convictions, it is a lengthy rap sheet, and he's convicted of a number of charges that really get to the heart of not just diverting humanitarian aid, but really becoming almost part and parcel of a terrorist organization. If you read through the conviction, it almost reads as if World Vision's operations in Gaza were merged into Hamas. And why do I say that? If you look at the rap sheet, you'll find that he was convicted of a number of issues. So first of all, he tried to recruit other people into Hamas. and then he took World Vision materials and diverted to Hamas to construct tunnels. So talking about iron, talking about plastic tubing, talking about digging implements, all sorts of things that it would be reasonable for a humanitarian organization to have possession of, he provided to Hamas so that Hamas could build installations, including tunnels. And the conviction says that on a number of instances, he even toured some of these military installations. And so it's not as if, he handed it over to someone and he didn't know what it was being used for. He's placed in these specific Hamas military installations that he's assisting in converting. Another thing that he was convicted of was diverting funds to members of Hamas's armed wing. And so you have, money being provided to members of Hamas. You also have specific aid, humanitarian packages that he ensured would go to members of Hamas. So for instance, you have some sort of humanitarian aid package that might have medicines, or it might have food, or it might have other items. And so he would distribute it, or ensure that they would be distributed to members of Hamas. He was convicted of procuring weapons for Hamas, not just weapons, but also other equipment that was used by Hamas's naval commandos. The Israeli court found him guilty of intelligence gathering, of basically going to border areas with Hamas officials to identify different places along the border. And so you have a whole host of activities that show that he is essentially, again, it doesn't say this in the conviction, but this is sort of my own take on it, is essentially merging World Vision's operations in Gaza with Hamas. He's using Hamas-linked actors for tenders. He is hiring Hamas members to perform duties for World Vision. And so what emerges from this is a situation whereby it is very, very difficult for someone to distinguish between the legitimate activities of a humanitarian actor and a group that is diverting its materials to a terrorist organization. So for instance, if an external auditor came and wanted to see, did World Vision provide humanitarian aid, they would say, yes, we paid for, just to use a round number, we paid for 1,000 humanitarian kits, and all the humanitarian kits were signed out properly from the warehouse and they were provided to families. What they wouldn't know is that all the people that have been selected were Hamas members or people close to Hamas. They would see that, tenders had been issued for local contracts. They wouldn't know that those groups were linked to Hamas and were possibly involved in kickbacks. They would see that, materials had been signed out properly, or that agricultural centers had been set up in different parts of Gaza. They wouldn't know that potentially lurking underneath those hothouses or those other agricultural centers is Hamas military infrastructure. And so it becomes very, very difficult in certain instances to distinguish between what would appear to any outside observer, an uneducated outside observer, as legitimate humanitarian action from what it actually was, which is, sneakily diverting aid materials to Hamas, both to sort of fund Hamas members and provide them with materials, through these humanitarian materials, but also through actually developing Hamas infrastructure, weapons procurement, intelligence gathering, equipping commandos, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's one of the challenges that we have with the Chalabi case. It's a much more sophisticated form of aid diversion. This isn't simply, somebody, left the barn door open in the warehouse and somebody raided it in the middle of the night. This is much more sophisticated and much more complicated to untangle. It's a web that's much more difficult to untangle. One of the things that is interesting, and I think this helps move us into the conversation surrounding oversight and what could have been done and what was known, is that within World Vision, there was a whistleblower. And so one of the very, very interesting things that we learned in the course of the trial, or not in the course of the trial, but one of the very interesting things that we learned in the conviction is that someone in Gaza, an accountant in Gaza, had raised concerns about aid diversion to Hamas and was then fired. So what I want to point out, hold on, let me just look at my notes for one brief moment, is I want to talk for a second about the issue of the whistleblower and what that tells us about World Vision's own commitment to oversight and the extent to which it was effective at overseeing what was going on in Gaza. So I want to read two quotes to you. These are NGO Monitor translations of the Beersheba District Court conviction. And so here's the first quote. The complaint of Mohammed Mehdi, a World Vision accountant during the period relevant for the indictment, alleged to the organization inter alia that the defendant used the organization's money to assist Hamas. Mehdi described the operative mechanism that the defendant used, which were consistent with the mechanisms that were detailed by the defendant in his indictment. So in plain English, the judge is essentially saying that at World Vision, there was an accountant who was working there during the time that the court is looking at, who alleged to World Vision that Chalabi was diverting money to Hamas, and that his charges, Mehdi's allegations, are consistent with Chalabi's own admissions of guilt or things that he had said during interrogation. The second quote deals with World Vision itself and with Chalabi himself. It says, quote, furthermore, the circumstances of Mohammed Mehdi's firing from World Vision and his interrogation by Hamas and the discovery of his interrogation on the defendant's personal computer also constitute a significant evidential addition to the defendant's confession. So essentially what the judge is saying here is that not long after he had complained, Mohammed Mehdi was fired. He was arrested and interrogated by Hamas forces in Gaza, and that on Mohammed al-Chalabi's personal computer that was confiscated by Israel, the Israeli authorities found materials related to Hamas's interrogation of this World Vision whistleblower. And so that obviously is a very damning piece of evidence against al-Chalabi pertaining to his relationship with Hamas, that he has access to information gleaned from Hamas interrogations. But it also speaks to problems that arose in the oversight within World Vision over what was going on in Gaza related to Chalabi's time there. And in fact, the judge in the case here in Israel dedicated a significant portion of his writings to describing the failures that existed within World Vision. And so I just want to turn for a moment to some of the things that the judge noted about World Vision's own oversight. And so the judge said, quote, they, this is referring to World Vision's employees that testified, quote, are apparently trapped in a preconceived notion that does not accord with the circumstances in the region, that their professionalism will absolutely and always prevent any fraud or abuse of faith. And so, you know, there seems to be a sense of naivete on the part of the organization. The judge also said the insistence on the notion that the organization could not be deceived is liable to create a lack of vigilance to prevent deceit. You know, and I could go on and on and on with statements made by the judge in this case, but I think the one that is, I think, the best is that the judge wrote that World Vision employed, quote, remote control oversight, that there really wasn't any sort of close auditing done of what was going on in World Vision, and that they relied very, very heavily on the reports provided by Chalabi to the organization. And so once Chalabi himself obviously was proved to be, we'll call him an unreliable source of information, that very much colored everything that World Vision saw itself. And you know, Alan at the beginning of this referenced Tim Costello, who for many years headed World Vision in Australia. Tim Costello and others within the World Vision framework immediately rejected the Israeli allegations when they were made in August 2016. And one of the things that he said was that there's no way that these allegations could be accurate, that there's no way that Chalabi could have diverted $50 million in aid materials, that the whole budget of World Vision's Gaza branch didn't reach that threshold of $50 million. So therefore, it's impossible for that to be true. And one of the things I want to show you is that very statement, that very allegation speaks to a lot of the problems in this case, of World Vision not knowing what's going on in its own operations. And the reason I say that is twofold. One, NGO Monitor's own independent research into World Vision's financials, particularly the financials of their operations here in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, but also to another court case that many of you probably don't know about that has not garnered the same level of international scrutiny and attention into World Vision's Israeli nonprofit branch. And so I want to start for a moment here. For this, I will share my screen. Let me just hold on one moment. World Vision financials. Here we go. So what I'm showing you now is a table that NGO Monitor put together a few years ago, looking at the World Vision Jerusalem, West Bank, Gaza branches income from 2004 to 2015. This covers a significant part of the period in which Chalabi was working at the organization. And so what you see here is that the income, while Tim Costello said, for the period of time in question, never reached $50 million. How could Chalabi have diverted over $50 million? We found over, essentially $130 million worth of income. We found significant funding from World Vision branches around the world, including from World Vision Australia. And so it was very difficult to reconcile the data that we found from Jerusalem, from the World Vision Jerusalem, West Bank, Gaza branch, and Tim Costello and others' statements. And as we dug a little bit more into this, we discovered a very strange state of affairs, which was that here in the region, World Vision was operating multiple entities. There was an entity called World Vision Israel. There was an entity called World Vision Jerusalem, West Bank, Gaza. There was World Vision international projects that were going on here. And so these multiplicity of frameworks made it very difficult for us to ascertain what precisely was going on. But it also, based on our own understanding of the financials and based on the claims made by others in World Vision, made it clear to us that it wasn't clear that World Vision officials knew what was going on here. And that brings me to the last piece of information that I want to present to you tonight, and then I'm happy to open it up, is this other court case that's currently underway here in Jerusalem. This is an audit being done of World Vision's Israel branch. And the audit essentially is looking at the nonprofit to understand if the nonprofit is meeting the standards for Israeli nonprofits. And I'll give you sort of the bottom line, which is no. The court here, or I'm sorry, not the court, the registrar of nonprofits, which is the branch of the Israeli government responsible for regulating Israeli nonprofits, has petitioned the court to disband World Vision's nonprofit here in Israel. And one of the reasons, or the primary reason, is financial mismanagement and just a lack of oversight on the part of the branch. And some of the findings that have been made is that some of the funds from the World Vision Israel nonprofit have made it to Hamas members. There's all sorts of evidence that has been put in front of the court showing that the board of World Vision Israel doesn't know what's going on with the financials. They can't provide information about any projects that the group may have undertaken, that there's millions of shekels in missing funds that are unaccounted for, that a significant amount of the organization's transactions or withdrawals are being made in cash, that there are multiple bank accounts that up until recently the nonprofit was maintaining, a whole slew of very serious financial irregularities. And so this just proves to us, this is another piece of information that we look at that seems to corroborate our own findings, which is that there are a lot of financial irregularities. There's serious discrepancies between the reporting done by various World Vision branches, and that a lot of the numbers don't add up. And so when we see protestations on the part of, Tim Costello and others within the World Vision community about what is or isn't going on at World Vision, it's clear to us that at best they themselves are often unaware of what's going on in their own branches. So just to sum it up before I hand the reins back to Alan, throughout this whole process, we've seen that World Vision organizationally is willing to partner with terror-linked actors, is willing to be flexible about who it's going to negotiate with, who it's going to engage with in order to provide humanitarian aid. We've seen very serious allegations and ultimately convictions against Mohammed al-Khalabi that really speak to essentially a merging of World Vision operations in Gaza with those of Hamas, to the point where it's very, very difficult to identify where humanitarian action begins or where humanitarian action ends and where terrorist activity begins. And then we spoke a little bit about the inability or the unwillingness of World Vision to properly audit it. That people working in World Vision had this preconceived notion that they could handle it, that they knew what they were doing, that there wouldn't be any problems, and that ultimately, NGO Monitor's own research and the independent audit commissioned by the Israeli Register of Nonprofits showed conclusively that, World Vision entities here in the region were poorly managed, did not have proper financial controls, and that it's really unclear what's being done with the money or what humanitarian projects are actually being implemented. So that sort of in a nutshell is some of the things that we found. And I'm happy to turn it over to Alan for the rest of the questions.
Thanks, Yona. That's very interesting. Just before we get to questions, I'll remind people that if you're listening on J-Air, this is the Australian Jewish Association, which we have a meeting which we have every Wednesday night. Our guest tonight is Yona Schiffmiller from NGO Monitor, and we're discussing World Vision in Gaza and the conviction of Mohammed al-Khalabi. Just before we get to questions, I'll hand back to David for a quick moment to tell us what's coming up next week.
Thank you very much, Alan. Firstly, as we always do, if there's anyone watching this evening that is not yet supporting AJA after this event, please go to the website jewishassociation.org.au where you can apply for membership, you can sign up to the email list, and of course don't forget to like and follow the AJA Facebook page for daily updates on news and views. Next week we have the story of what really happened in South Australia with regard to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. We have Sarah Game, member of the Legislative Council of South Australia, joining us. She's the first Jewish member of the South Australian Parliament for 100 years. She worked closely with AJA in getting the success of the IHRA adopted in that particular jurisdiction, and some of the reporting that's been done in the Jewish press has frankly been, to use a Trump phrase, fake news. So you will hear next week directly from the principal player what actually happened on the ground.
Thanks, David. So we're going to take questions. I've just got one or two of my own before we throw it open. Yona, as expected, when the verdict was announced, Tim Costello criticised it as, quote, a travesty of justice. He called al-Khalabi a hero, and he listed a range of complaints about the Israeli judicial system. So now, given that it was a closed trial, I guess my question is, why was it a closed trial? Because doesn't this throw a whole layer of suspicion over the process and actually make it easier for people to dispute the facts?
Well, I certainly agree that having a closed trial, there are trade-offs to anything. And so using a closed trial definitely prioritizes secrecy over garnering support for the conviction. So Israel, in this instance, I think because of the sensitivity of the classified information, that they were relying on whatever intelligence gathering methods were employed to find, to discover this information and to bring al-Khalabi to justice. Those were the things that Israel didn't want revealed in open court. And certainly, when you take that step to conceal your methods and to, preference confidentiality and secrecy, that is always going to open you up to allegations of, how is this information discovered and is it credible? I think Israel was aware that was a charge that was going to be leveled against it, and ultimately decided to put its weight on the side of protecting the intelligence community and protecting the intelligence gathering methods. So, I think Israel knew full well what the results would be in that case, but ultimately, it decided to prioritize one over the other.
And has there been general acceptance about the process, or have there been other countries and organisations that have risen up and accused Israel of corruption in this trial?
Well, certainly we've seen, diplomats are always obviously keen to question Israel and keen to question the judiciary. I certainly understand the desire for an open trial. I think all of us understand the value of transparency in judicial matters, in government affairs. I think as a general rule, I think we all think that transparency is a good way to achieve justice. But nevertheless, I think we also recognize that in certain circumstances, there is need to balance it with other considerations. And again, ultimately Israel decided that, those considerations were more important to it than how the result would be perceived.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so it's over to you. I've got David, Ron, Leon, Jason, and Rachel's phone or computer. So David, you'll be first. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
It's David Schulberg from the Israel Connection on J-Air. Yona, I have a couple of quick questions. Firstly, is a full translation of the court verdict available in English? And what is going to be the timeline on the Jerusalem court decision on whether the World Vision will be permitted to continue in Israel? Are we going to wait another 6 years?
Okay, so I'll take the first question first. I'm not sure if there is a full translation in English. I'm happy to put here in the chat our analysis of the verdict, which includes our own translations of key portions of it. I'm not sure if I suspect that there is not a full English translation, but as we speak, I'll put in the chat our analysis. And again, as I said, that includes significant portions of the conviction. As far as the Jerusalem District Court, I don't think it's going to take another 6 years. When the court will rule on the petition to disband, I'm not quite sure. I suspect, I think it would be probably unwise of me or irresponsible of me to try to throw out a date, but I would expect that it's not going to take 6 years. I think this will be a little bit quicker.
Yes, so Yona, what are the potential consequences of all of this? Does World Vision get thrown out of Israel and that's the end of it, or are there broader ramifications that may come out?
So when we talk about World Vision, one of the things that we have to remember is World Vision is not monolithic. There is no one thing necessarily that's called World Vision. There's World Vision Australia and there's World Vision International. There are different World Vision branches in different parts of the world. And so the court case pertains to the Israeli nonprofit of World Vision, and it's entirely possible that that institution and that mechanism will be disbanded, but we may continue to see World Vision International implement humanitarian efforts in the West Bank and Gaza in conjunction with other international donors or with United Nations agencies. So just because the court in Jerusalem may disband the nonprofit doesn't necessarily mean that we won't see World Vision involved on the ground anymore.
Okay, so in effect, they can just continue to do what they want to do, really, can't they?
I mean, there certainly may still be World Vision activities that we're going to see here in the future. Hopefully, with better oversight and better,
yes.
better internal mechanisms.
Okay, thank you, Ron. Your turn. Then Leon, Jason, Rachel, if Rachel's going to ask the question, and Hugh.
Thank you, Yona, for the interesting explanation. I would like to ask you, this seems to mirror what's just happened with the European Union and the Al-Haq and the PFLP donating to Al-Haq, which had links to PFLP. How do you deal with these things in a practical manner? because the European Union has rejected the evidence that Israel gave them. How do you deal with that?
Sure. So I'm happy to answer. Although maybe I'll take about a minute to just give just a little bit of background to the question for those who may be less familiar
Yes,
with
please.
the phenomenon that's being discussed. In October of 2021, the Israeli government designated 6 Palestinian NGOs as terrorist entities. These are all organizations that are linked to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, which is an internationally designated terrorist organization, still active today, still trying to murder Jews today. And so the Israeli government makes that designation in October of 2021. For years prior, NGO Monitor has been researching these organizations, publishing reports highlighting how these groups are linked to the PFLP. Again, open source research, all things that we know, sort of secret, clandestine methods, just people who are very, very good at looking at Google and Facebook and Twitter. And so what has happened, what was referenced is one of the organizations that was designated by Israel is a group called El-Haq. El-Haq is an organization that is staunchly opposed to Israel's existence, recently published a report that basically calling Israel an apartheid state was probably the least offensive part of that report, that Zionism is racism and that Israel should totally be dismantled and that the state has no legitimacy, and I could go on, but needless to say, not a friend of Israel. And the European Union, based on material given to it by the Israeli government, had frozen its funding to El-Haq. So this is material that's purported to show the ties between El-Haq and the PFLP. Based on that information, the EU froze funding to the organization. There have recently been reports suggesting that the EU is now going to reinstate its funding. However, what I will say in that context, and I would caution, is the only people so far that have published that information is Al-Haq itself and media outlets quoting Al-Haq. No one in the European Union has publicly corroborated that report yet. And so it's as of yet unclear what will eventually happen. I'll say sort of in broad strokes that within the European Union, there is a little bit of a struggle between those within the EU that wants to take a harder line on preventing terror funding, and those that want to be more sympathetic to Palestinian organizations and want to continue to work with some of these groups. So without getting into too much detail, I think that that sort of explains where we're at now with the European Union, where there is sort of this internal conflict between different factions within the EU as to what to do about the Israeli designations.
Yeah, Yona, does the EU issue any comment about this decision at all, or do they just stay away from those things?
We're talking about the
El Halabi case. Yeah, do they make any comments, or does the United Nations make any comments?
I don't remember the EU off the top of my head. I can go back and look, but I don't remember off the top of my head. There definitely was criticism from from a variety of organizations, although it did not become sort of the media circus that some in Israel were concerned that it might be. It didn't quite garner, it didn't become this international touchstone in the way that some thought it might have become.
Okay, thank you. Leon, your turn. Please unmute yourself, and then it's Jason.
Oh, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Is there any evidence in the background of non-Arab officials of World Vision to suggest that it wasn't just negligence, but active cooperation with Hamas? We know that in some of these organizations, there are people who are personally very inimical to Israel's existence. Do you know anything about the backgrounds of some of the non-Arab officials to suggest that they might have been active collaborators?
Well, we certainly know that within World Vision, there are those that, as you said, are highly critical of Israel. But the court was really just focusing on El-Halabi himself and his own activities, and certainly we've seen that there was a breakdown when it came to oversight. There was a breakdown when it came to financial management. But to go beyond that and to suggest that anyone else was involved, that's beyond anything that I'm aware of. I don't know what information the Israeli agencies and the Israeli authorities may have found in the course of their investigation and interrogations. All I can say is the publicly available information really focused in on El-Khalbi himself. So, I can't speak to who else in the organization may or may not have been involved, but there was nothing at least publicly alleged to suggest that there were others that were going about this willingly. I can say that in the course of the trial in the Jerusalem District Court, looking at the Israeli nonprofit, they found that checks belonging to the nonprofit were found in the possession of Hamas members. And what the Israeli Registrar of Nonprofits said in relation to that was that at best, this shows, negligence, financial mismanagement, and so on and so forth. But again, I can't suggest that it goes beyond El-Khalbi himself.
Thank you. Jason, your turn. Please unmute yourself.
Good evening, sir. Look, very quickly, two questions, if I may. Firstly, what is known, if anything, about the fate of that whistleblower? And secondly, and this is probably a rhetorical question, would it be possible for any well-intentioned NGO, World Vision or otherwise, to operate in Gaza or the PA without being compromised by the problematic terrorist organizations that exist in those areas?
Okay, so as to the first question, the whistleblower testified in the case. So I'm not sure where his whereabouts are, but he's, alive and well at the very least. I'm not quite sure how he got out or what the story is behind it, but he did testify in the case. To your second question, that is, a fundamental challenge that we've identified when it comes to, operations in conflict zones. This isn't just about Gaza. This is, places around the world. And you're right, there is a real concern as to how do you operate in these areas. It's certainly a challenge. We think that it is incumbent on governments in particular that when they are providing aid, that they, in concert with the humanitarian aid providers, put in place rigorous steps to ensure that funding materials aren't diverted. And one of the things that I think is interesting to note is that within the humanitarian aid community, there has been really strong pushback to this. And this is really, since 9/11, this has been, I think, a very contentious point between government funders on the one hand and humanitarian actors on the other, where increasingly the donor community is placing greater emphasis on anti-fraud, anti-corruption, anti-terror regulations. And increasingly the aid community is essentially saying, we don't want strings attached. We don't want to be told, who to work with and how to distribute our aid. We want to be able to do this, freely as we see fit, to work with whomever we deem necessary. And so it really is a contentious issue, between the donor community and the aid community. And I can say that, just as a quick aside, this isn't even the only conflict zone in which World Vision has run afoul of this. The U.S. Senate a couple of years ago launched an investigation into World Vision operations in Sudan, where it found that World Vision, while receiving money from the U.S. government to do humanitarian action in Sudan, partnered with an Islamist terrorist organization with ties to bin Laden that was on the U.S. terrorist, a designated U.S. terrorist organization. So this is not just a Gaza problem. It's not just a West Bank problem. This is, I think as you alluded to, this is a global question as to how exactly work in these areas.
And would World Vision have a generally good reputation? I mean, they obviously work in a lot of countries. If people, there are a lot of people that want to donate to World Vision. So are people able to donate to one branch and not another branch, or is it the whole organisation? And what's their reputation like?
I mean, it's hard for me to say conclusively because I'm certainly not an expert on all World Vision operations around the world. What I can say is that different branches donate to each other. So we found that for World Vision operations here, they'd received funds from, let me just pull it up quickly, but they had received funds from a variety of World Vision branches around the world. So even if you gave money, say, to World Vision Australia, some of that money came here. World Vision USA gave money here, Canada, UK, Germany. And so, there's definitely funding that's going from different branches of World Vision to operations around the world. Certainly when I see an organization that has publicly stated, its employees have publicly stated that they're not sure about the way that they engage with armed actors, and that we now know of at least 2 instances in different parts of the world in which their aid was either diverted or they worked with a terrorist organization, that definitely does, I think, give me pause about trusting, the organization. I certainly wouldn't say that everything that World Vision does is nefarious or bad, but I wouldn't take their word for it. I think that would be the way that I would look at it, is I would be very, very skeptical of things that World Vision itself is saying about its own aid programs.
Thank you. Hugh, it's your turn. Hugh is in the UK. Now, normally we have more people than time, so we do have some space. So if you do want to ask a question, now's the time to put your hand up. And I see Robert has just done that. So Hugh, fire away.
Hello, Yona. I used to make a lot of documentary films for international aid agencies. And while I never did for World Vision, I did see their operations in the field, both in Bangladesh and in Somalia. Now, World Vision is an ostensibly Christian organization, and Tim Costello, I believe, is an ordained Baptist minister. And speaking as a Christian myself, I'm absolutely appalled by their actions. My question is, are there other Christian organizations, for instance, Christian Aid, which belongs to the Church of England, the Anglican Church? They often come out with anti-Israel rhetoric. Are you investigating these other organizations and their work in Gaza and the West Bank?
So we definitely try to look at, as broad a swath of information we can about the different organizations that are operating on the ground. Certainly within the context of the Christian world, there are a host of groups, as you said, like Christian Aid, that are very, very critical. There are some that are, there are some that aren't. I don't think I can, I wouldn't want to paint, I wouldn't want to paint with a broad brush, about the organized Christian world. Obviously, it's very, very broad, different countries around the world. But I would say that there certainly is, I believe Christian Aid is a Catholic organization. I may be wrong about that.
He said Anglican. Anglican.
Christian Aid is an Anglican organization, right? So forgive me if I misspoke. I can certainly say that in Europe, in particular, there are a number of Catholic organizations that are highly critical and promote BDS activity, promote BDS lobbying against Israel. And so, I think obviously the Christian world is diverse, multifaceted, and you have all sorts of different voices, but certainly in the European context in particular, there definitely is, I would say particularly with the European Catholic community, a lot of those organizations or a lot of the institutions representing, the Catholic community in Europe, there is a lot of, problematic rhetoric or partnerships with problematic organizations that we were concerned about. But we haven't necessarily seen anything that rises to the level of, terror diversion, from at the level of a World Vision or something like that.
Okay, Robert, have you got some written questions? And then we have Anna.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask you a related question. What about some of the Australian organizations? I think some of the union organizations and some Christian organizations here, are there any in particular that you've come across or that people should look out for that are quite problematic?
Oh, wow. So I think, let me take a, what I would say to that, hold on one second, I actually have something open. Let me see when the last time we updated this was.
There are a lot of organizations that want to do humanitarian work in Gaza, and presumably for most of them, we would say that they're very altruistic and they're motivated by good ideals, but it's very easy for things to go wrong in that part of the world, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I can say is, we are somewhat aware of FADA, which is, I believe, is linked to one of the trade unions in Australia. You know, we know that they've worked with a group in Gaza called Ma'an Development Center, and one of Ma'an Development Center's former employees was himself linked to the PFLP, this terrorist organization that I referenced earlier, and that FADA has also worked with, you know, a couple other institutions that may be linked in some way or another to the PFLP, or at least have, maybe if the organization isn't linked, have had individuals working at those organizations that may have PFLP links. But you know, I don't want to go too far out on a limb. I'm not an expert in FADA and some of the other organizations that are operating in Australia.
Okay, Anna, please unmute yourself and ask your questions.
All right. I have had contact with World Vision over 20 years ago. They were problematic in their general operations, not just with the embezzlement. I saw an ad about 20 years ago asking for subscribers to support young Christian girls in Africa, who were the most marginalized people in that continent, to help educate them. So it started out at $10 a month, which was affordable. Then within a fairly short time, it went to $25, to $35, then to $40. And eventually I got a letter saying she is no longer part, and everything I got from her was semi-literate, so I don't know what education she was getting. But I got a letter to say she's just turned 16, she's no longer part of our program, but anyway, she got married last week. So I don't know who they sold her to. Anyway, would I like another one? So I tried again, and exactly the same story 5 years later. So even in their general operations, this organization was totally unethical. And then came Halabi. So, you know, the whole thing stank to high heaven for me.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Yona, I imagine you've probably heard stories like that before.
Well, I mean, it shows, if nothing else, that inflation isn't just a 2022 problem, that we've, you know, inflation is something we've been dealing with for a long time. Yeah, I mean, you know, it is upsetting to hear, and certainly, you know, we've seen this happen in a number of other contexts. I'm sure you're aware of, you know, some of the other scandals that have plagued the humanitarian aid community, you know, whether it be abuse of children in Haiti, or other abuses that took place, you know, in other third world countries. So, you know, one of the things that Professor Gerald Steinberg, who is the president and founder of NGO Monitor, has always spoken about is the halo effect. And this is essentially the, you know, what he defines the halo effect is essentially people look at humanitarian actors, or human rights activists as do-gooders. These are people that are fundamentally good, and the institutions that they represent are fundamentally good. And, you know, one of the things that he's been trying to enlighten people to over the years is that these are institutions just like any other, and that we should be as critical of humanitarian actors and human rights organizations as we are of corporations, as we are of banks, as we are of governments, that some of them may do good work, some of them might do bad work, some of the people that work there might be good people, some of the people might be of poor character, and that we shouldn't, you know, monolithically look at them and say these are do-gooders, everything they do is righteous and just.
Okay, thank you. David, you've got your hand up again, have you? Do you have another quick question? David Schulberg? Yeah.
Well, I don't have a question, I have a story.
As long as it's very quick.
It's a story where in my early days as an Israel advocate, I thought it was a good idea at one point to organize a debate on the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. And I thought we could raise some money and donate it to some of these charities. I found that the charities were not willing to abide by an arrangement where half the money would go towards Israel and half the money towards Palestinian organizations.
Interesting.
I didn't agree with it. Action Aid were one of the charities that
Yeah.
involved, and Action Aid, they're not Christian, but they're totally run by women.
Okay, thanks, David. Now, look, just before we finish up, I wanted to ask Yona, we've all been watching the events of the last week or so when the violence escalated, with Israel taking preemptive action to prevent a terror attack by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And interestingly, Hamas remained very quiet over this, but of course they're never very far away from instigating violence themselves. Yona, do you want to just in a minute or so give us your thoughts on what happened, and do you think that that Operation Breaking Dawn is now over?
So as far as the operation itself, I think, you know, the ceasefire has been maintained. I think the last rocket was fired, you know, a few days ago. So from that standpoint, I think the current round of fighting is behind us. You know, you noted Hamas's relative inaction. I think that from Hamas's standpoint, you know, they have different interests. So on the one hand, they obviously have no love for Israel and are always happy to see Israel suffer and to see Israel attacked, and would like to fight Israel again in the future. But at the same time, they do have a responsibility to their own population. Governing Gaza, you know, requires them to consider other considerations, not to use the same word twice in the same sentence. But, you know, they can't fight Israel all the live long day. They do need to provide for their own local population. And so I think from Hamas's perspective, Islamic Jihad, which has none of those responsibilities, they can freely go and fight Israel, and they don't necessarily have to worry about the ramifications for the civilian population. Islamic Jihad is a bit of a thorn in Hamas's side. And so if you're Hamas, to have your two enemies fight each other isn't necessarily so terrible. Hamas is happy to see Israelis run to the bomb shelter. Hamas doesn't necessarily mind seeing Islamic Jihad get a black eye. And so, you know, I think one of the things that was notable is that Israel refrained from targeting Hamas infrastructure. Israel didn't attack Hamas officials, didn't go after Hamas members, didn't bomb Hamas sites. And so I think from Hamas's perspective, as long as this didn't go on for too long, obviously it can't, you know, allow Israel to strike Gaza for a week or 2 weeks and not get involved. But as long as Israel kept it short and just directed its fire toward Islamic Jihad, I think at this particular moment, Hamas is willing to sit on the side. Obviously, circumstances could change in the future. You know, there might be a future escalation where Israel attacks Islamic Jihad and Hamas does get involved, but at least at this particular juncture, you know, they didn't mind seeing us and Islamic Jihad duke it out for a couple of days.
Okay, we've come up to time. Yona Schiffmiller from NGO Monitor, thank you so much for all your fantastic work and keeping on top of this story. I want to thank also NGO Monitor in general and Gerald Steinberg, who's been a guest on our sessions before. You just do amazing work, and all power to you. I've put the website up on the chat, so I encourage people to go to the website and check it out, and they can follow you there. So Yona, thank you very much again, and thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you. That's all we have for tonight. Just before we go, the L'Chaim program with Morris Klein is now on. It's at 3ZZZ, which is FM 92.3 or 3ZZZ.com.au. That's all we have for tonight. Join us next week with Sarah Game and David Adler speaking about IHRA in South Australia. Don't forget, you can keep up to date with what AJA is talking about on our Facebook page. So please like it and share it widely. But for now, we wish you all a very good evening and look forward to seeing you next week as usual. From me, it's good night to you all. Bye for now.